This is Henri Bergson. He's on Wikipedia. He was born 1859 and he died in 1941. He was a philosopher and he got a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927. He disagreed with Einstein in the early days of when Einstein became famous after 1919 about relativity, and he never agreed with Einstein about relativity. So I want to go to a talk which is dealing with this. So expand this. So I'm going to play this talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about my work and say a little bit about myself. I'm a historian of science. I'm a writer and a professor. And one of the things that I like to do as a historian of science is to analyze the history of facts, scientific facts. So one of my colleagues, the sociologist Harry Collins, describes facts as ships in a bottle, arguing that they're carefully constructed to pretend, to seem as if no one was there to build them. And another wonderful philosopher and sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, describes facts as frozen vegetables. And he argues that facts need a bevy of support networks in order to thrive and to be around us. So with that, let me move on to the topic of my talk today. This is the book that I will be talking about, this debate, and it's a debate between Einstein and Bergson that took place in April 6, 1922. And I came to this story after finishing my first book, A Tenth of a Second, A History. And this book analyzes why we became obsessed in the second half of the 19th century with measuring speeds of the order of a tenth of a second and much shorter than that. So I joke that I've written the longest book about the shortest time period in history. And when I was concluding that book, towards the end of the chapter, I encountered an amazing document, and I think of myself as a historian of the 19th century. And I knew that one of the most prominent intellectuals of the 19th century was Henri Bergson. And I encountered this document right here. This is a transcript of a meeting between philosophers that took place at the Société Française de Philosophie on that fateful day, 6th of April, 1922. And I was studying Bergson, as I mentioned, and what I found in this transcript is that this man, this philosopher, was in the same room with Albert Einstein, and they were discussing the nature of time. And we actually have a record of what he said and what the other person said and what people in the audience said. So the more that I looked into this moment, the more that I understood that it was a huge story. And one of the reasons why it became so important and frequently cited in primary sources of the early 20th century was that the debate was listed as one of the reasons why Einstein never got the prize, the Nobel Prize for the theory of relativity. So the presenter of the prize, during his presentation speech, said something. He said, "It will be no secret that the famous philosopher Bergson in Paris has challenged the theory." And then he went on to explain that the theory of relativity pertained, that Bergson had argued that the theory of relativity pertained to epistemology, and therefore it did not merit the prize for physics, which Einstein ended up getting for the photoelectric effect and for his work on Brownian motion, which were two areas that he had worked on, which are incredibly important for physics, but that did not juggle the imagination as much as relativity, and hadn't brought Einstein fame as relativity had. So Einstein was kind of stubborn, and in the presentation speech, he decided to talk anyway about relativity. So I knew that Bergson was an extremely, after they went to his lectures.
So, there you have it. It was probably the talk between Bergson and Einstein which stopped Einstein from being able to get a Nobel Prize for relativity. Einstein got his Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect and other things in physics, but not for relativity. So this is why this dialogue between them is so important. Now if I get to the next, what I think important bit, so coming up to what I think is another important bit, it's about three people who disagreed with Einstein, and their names were Henri. All three people were Henri. If I can get to that, it's coming up about now.
And that is that it's invariant, that it is independent of the source of its motion,
this bit's not
and that
important.
therefore leads to the effects
It's
of
coming up in a minute
theory,
about the Henries.
the most stunning of which are time dilation and length dilation. That time expands according to the velocity, and length as well, and masses, of course, increase. And all this is from the special theory of relativity.
This is the three Henries.
So Einstein, when he first published the beginning of the theory of relativity was 1905. Almost nobody cared about it. He then completed, worked further in it, and developed the general theory of relativity, which is more comprehensive, and that gave more importance to the special theory of relativity, but still nobody cared about it. He completed this at the end of 1915. And in 1916, in order to try to get more people interested, he actually wrote a popular book, a book for the reader, where he described the purpose of the book. He didn't describe it as something that would revolutionize everyday notions of space and time, but he described it of giving a reader some happy hours. And those are the famous stories where you see, where you've read, you probably were taught in high school, of being in the train carriage and seeing a flash of light here and a flash of light there, and being inside an elevator, and all these very evocative thought experiments that make him famous. But in 1919, he had a huge break, and this came with an eclipse expedition that was organized by British astronomers, and that's the moment where Einstein became a worldwide star. But there was one problem. What the eclipse expedition measured was the bending of light by the power of gravity. And that is something that's related to his theory of relativity, but it's very different to go from that from that insight to go all the way to the twin paradox. It requires a lot of work. And there were still three people, the ones that I call the three Henries, who were not convinced that Einstein's work would lead us to have to change our everyday notions of space and time. And that was the thing that they did not want to let go. They completely accepted the theory. They completely accepted all the experimental results. Hendrik Lorentz was a Dutch physicist. He came up with the equations that Einstein used in his special relativity paper. Henri Poincare was one of the most renowned physicists in France. And there was, of course, Henri Bergson. And all of these men were in conversation with each other, and they remained unconvinced that one needed to go take that further step. And this is what happened in 1922, where all these ideas just came to a head. So in 1922, we have at the Société Française de Philosophie, we have Einstein presenting his theory, and Bergson is in the audience. Langevin, in some of the descriptions, is shown as whispering ideas, whispering answers to Einstein, whose French was really not that great. And in the audience is Henri Bergson. And Einstein utters this phrase that served as a detonator for the debate, and he said, "Il n'y a donc pas un temps de philosophes," basically, could be translated as, "the time of the philosophers does not exist." And here he was face to face with one of the most important intellectuals of the era. Bergson responded with about half an hour, and much of it was later expanded and repeated in his book, Duration and Simultaneity. And what was Bergson's response? So Bergson wanted a notion of time that included new things emerging into the world. And Einstein was content with thinking that time was what clocks measured, and therefore any other notion of time, including a philosophical notion of time, was really not real. It was not objective, was the words that he used. Bergson, on the contrary, wanted to go to a more basic, more human notion of time, and this is a quote from the way that he responded. He said, irritated by the idea that one would measure time with clocks and that clocks would explain time in entirety, he said, if we didn't have a prior notion of time, clocks would be bits of machinery with which we would amuse ourselves. They would not be employed in classifying events, and the word events here is very important. They would exist for their own sake and not serve us. So he also wanted to think of clocks as servants for larger purposes, and instruments in general, scientific instruments, as servants. They would lose their raison d'être for the theoretician of relativity as for everybody else, for he too calls them in only to designate the time of an event. And later in the book, when Bergson was asked to explain time, he said, what is time? Time is action itself. Time is the emergence of something new via action. And recently, Einstein's theory has received quite a bit of criticism, or is widely acknowledged for not explaining the flow of time. His theory is the universe, the Einsteinian universe, is described as being a block universe where there's no way to distinguish what makes a now important from another now, from a separate now. There's really not a flow of time. In many places, Einstein said that our sense of temporality was an illusion of our senses, an infirmity of our senses that made us feel as if things were happening, but in reality, everything was already contained in this block universe. When Einstein's best friend, Besso, died, Einstein wrote a letter of condolences to his family, and he said, it really doesn't matter, because for us physicists of faith, he said, the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is just an illusion.
So there you go. There's the three Henries, and they disagreed with Einstein about relativity, specifically about time. How Einstein was dealing with time, they did not agree with. So I'll go on to the next bit. These three Henries never agreed with Einstein about time. So it's coming up here.
Once again, together, I think that we need to know knowledge and scientific knowledge, but that we can also add to it knowledge about knowledge. and that includes history and who made this knowledge and for what purpose and in what context. And this is what I try to do in my work, and will continue to do in my future work if I get a chance. So thank you.
That was the end of the talk, and now it's going to be a question about the Henries. Now comes a question about the Henries.
I do have a question over here. Did either Henri Bergson or any of the other Henries recant or say that they really felt strongly that Einstein was right?
Never. Never, absolutely never. Henri Poincare died in 1911, I think at the end of 1911, but Lorentz lived to see the debate and beyond that. Bergson died in the 1930s, right with the occupation of Paris, and Bergson said that he had been misunderstood, and Einstein also would claim that he was misunderstood. So I had the challenge of writing a book where there's no agreement in the end, and it's about a book, and I think historians don't do this frequently, but I decided to write a book about misunderstanding and mistrust, and we never have a positive resolution, and we have a world divided, intellectuals divided, disciplines divided, still taking sides. Sometimes violent confrontations continue to happen. And there were people that were not happy with me reviving the debate between the two men.
Hi.
So there you have it. The three Henries never agreed with Einstein about time in relativity. Bergson, Henri Bergson, never agreed. Henri Poincare never agreed. Lorentz never agreed. And how do the physics people respond in the physics community? They would prefer this debate not to be raised. They want to have it suppressed. They don't want it raised, the issue that there is this fundamental disagreement about how time is being dealt with in relativity. And it was pointed out right after Einstein became famous in 1919 by Bergson, and I think the year they cited was 1922. That's it, thank you.